Welcome to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Cancel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. I'm back this week for a monthly episode for the Disputes and Investigations part of the podcast. Dina is joining me this week. Hello, Dina.
Hi, Meg.
Good to have you on, and we've got a special guest. We've got Sean McGuiness, who's an investment manager at Omni Bridgeway, one of the leading litigation funders in the market. Hi, Sean. How are you?
Hi, Meg. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, very well.
Yes, lovely to have you both on. Bit of a kind of long discussion today on litigation funding. Why don't we start with kind of the basics? Sean, why do you think litigation funding is important, and in particular with access to justice?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think litigation funding is important for a number of reasons, really. And I think you can probably think about a world where litigation funding doesn't exist to understand why it's so important. I think you highlighted in your question there the access to justice piece. That's the most commonly cited reason that litigation is important. I think we all know that going through the court process is expensive, and that has traditionally been a barrier to justice, which funding can help overcome. I think the commentators in the market as well still very much see that as the key benefit. So in the UK government over the summer said that it saw the litigation funding as having a critical role in ensuring access to justice, particularly ensuring access to justice in large scale and expensive cases. So again, sort of taking on the fact that these things can be very expensive to go through. There was also a report by Professor Rachel Mulheron of Queen Mary University earlier this year in March. Access to justice was one of the main benefits of funding that was the conclusion of that report. There, the example was given in the Competition Appeals Tribunal, which is where there's various collective actions brought, which would have been uneconomical to bring us as a single claimant. But by acting collectively and having funding behind it, it's been possible to bring those cases in to provide some justice to the claimants.
Thanks, Sean. Really interesting. So on that vein, I suppose, have you got an example of a case that you might have been involved in where litigation funding was really a crucial part of delivering justice for the claimants, maybe where they wouldn't have been able to do so without the funding behind them?
Yeah, so my sort of personal experience in litigation funding has been more reflective of my background, so in commercial dispute resolution, but there's a number that come to mind. So quite often we are approached by people that have been victims of frauds, so either scams that have been in the press, where pensioners have put some money in an investment that has not turned out to be legitimate. I've been involved in a number of cases where we've supported claimants to bring litigation and then make recoveries against often the sort of directors that have funneled funds offshore, and that's more in the kind of fraud and asset recovery space. But also quite recently I've been involved in a case with a number of small business owners in the UK that have it's quite a complex commercial dispute, but it's against a very large corporate, and each sort of case on its own wouldn't have been viable really to bring, but taking them together and putting together a funding package has allowed them to bring this claim, and that's still fairly early stages, but I think that will be one where funding really is supporting the access to justice story.
Fascinating. Yeah, the fraud and asset recovery point you mentioned is super interesting as well, because I think we see at Byfield that on such a large scale, going right down to kind of individual investors who've maybe put their money into an investment scheme that hasn't worked out, right through up to kind of on a sovereign level, and actually seeing funding being used across the full range of those types of cases. So yeah, really interesting. On that kind of same thread then, so obviously we've spoken about access to justice, but and you've also mentioned fraud and asset recovery, as well as, I suppose, kind of group claims and where it's small businesses that wouldn't have otherwise been able to kind of secure a route to litigation. what trends and area of focuses are you seeing in litigation funding, both in the UK but also around the world? I'm aware that Omni operates not just here in the UK but also globally as well.
Yeah, of course. So the crystal ball. I do think the data shows, and kind of experience, as you say, across our sort of global platform, shows that there's really an increase in demand for litigation funding. I think that's a function of the market's maturing. People are seeing litigation funding work. There's some high profile examples that I think we'll probably talk about later, but also just there's the access to justice angle, but on a sort of pure commercial angle, parties that have used litigation funding, I think there was a report recently that over 90% of them would use funding again. So it's being seen as a bit more of a risk management, corporate finance tool, increasingly, starting from an admittedly relatively low base, but that's certainly increasing demand. I think I was reading before we spoke about this, there's now reported to be $15 billion of assets under management and litigation funding, which is indicative of how much the demand has been. I think there's the couple of other things I'd point to, the secondary market. So traditionally, it's been very hard for litigation funders to offset some of their risk. You make the investment and then you're in the case for the life of it. We are definitely seeing a lot more secondary market transactions, and there's been quite a few public ones that funders have been involved with in the press. I think that is likely to continue, and I think that has a benefit to users of litigation funding, because it obviously improves liquidity in the market, and would hopefully unlock funding for more people who are looking for it. And I think the final, again, it's kind of a macro trend, I suppose, but the sort of increase in bankruptcies and distress has led to more inquiries and more demand for litigation funding where companies have found themselves in insolvent situations. So they're probably the three that I would point to as trends that I expect to continue.
That's amazing. And in terms of, maybe I guess now we're going to turn a bit more towards the controversies around the sector, but obviously there's been quite a few different opinions around what you guys charge. What are your thoughts on that kind of system?
Yeah, again, I think there was a Civil Justice Council report released just last week, actually, at the time that we're speaking. And this is obviously something that is being consulted on in the UK at the moment. And it's obviously something that we have a conversation with every time we speak to the counterparties that we're working with. I think where people tend to land after discussing it and thinking about it quite a lot is that most of the cases that are funded have been proposed to a number of funders, and the cases that tend to get funded often have multiple offers. So there is an element of market forces at play in the pricing, and the funders that have either priced too aggressively won't make any investments because they are trying to be too expensive, and the funders that underprice aren't around for very long. It's always an interesting one because it looks very expensive when the case succeeds, but obviously the inverse of that is if the case loses, the funder has often put in multiple millions of pounds or dollars and it walks away with nothing. So I think that at the moment, where the CJC seems to be landing is, as with the adverse cost insurance market, supply and demand and healthy competition is probably a good way to have pricing regulated at the moment. But I suppose we'll see where that lands.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, as you say, it's always an interesting topic when you get onto the feed. But I think my personal view is that funding is a crucial part of litigation, especially when you look at it from the access to justice lens. And so long as you're dealing with a reputable and sensible funder, then you're probably doing a sensible kind of business transaction, at least by getting a funder involved. Just turning then to kind of what funders are looking at. I've read and been hearing a bit in the market that funders are looking more closely at the likes of international arbitration. So I think it's fair to say that probably there's an assumption that funders have previously been involved heavily with class action lawsuits, because that's kind of got an inherent need for funders, because they're a group of people that maybe otherwise wouldn't have the resources to bring the claim. You mentioned your background is in commercial dispute resolution and fraud and asset recovery, but is that a trend that you're seeing too, that funders are looking more closely at international arbitration? And if so, do you think funding is suitable for international arbitration?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, primarily because the funding market, I think, has been looking at funding arbitrations and actively funding arbitrations for probably the best part of 10 years, at least. But I think the reason that hasn't necessarily been well known or in the press is because, you know, arbitrations by definition have been confidential, and the fact of funding has been confidential. So at my investment fund, Omni Bridgeway, we have a global international arbitration portfolio. And I think I was looking up before we spoke, GAR, so the Global Arbitration Review, estimated that there were 196 funded arbitrations for every year between 2019 and 2023, and that's increased slightly recently. So there's certainly, you know, on those numbers, sort of north of 1,000 international arbitrations that have some funding element with them. And I do think the class actions are obviously very high profile, but I think international arbitration does lend itself to funding in that there's often quite a bit of international enforcement expertise which can be required. You know, by definition, that the parties are in different jurisdictions. That's certainly something my team are focused on and can really add value on. And also the commercial arbitrations tend to be for high value sums, and that often attracts high value legal bills, which again makes funding a bit more attractive to the claimants. So absolutely, funding in arbitration is useful. It is continuing to take place, and I think we will continue to invest in that market.
Interesting, yeah, and the enforcement point that you raise is one that is kind of hot on my agenda as well, having experience of working with funders who have taken a claim through the arbitration up until getting a kind of favourable award, and then seeking to enforce that in multiple jurisdictions. And at that point as well, obviously the arbitration is no longer then confidential when you get into the enforcement, because you're going through high courts and whatnot, and then seeking to use the media to raise awareness of the enforcement activities that are going on, and probably try to put a bit of pressure on the opponent as well to try and get that enforcement to speed up and return on their quicker, I suppose, is the hope. So yeah, I think that's definitely an area where I think having a funder and then also having a PR team and comms team can work quite effectively together with the lawyers. So yeah, good to touch on that. So turning then to, I suppose, what is probably the most high profile example of funding in recent times, certainly in the UK, and the Horizon post office scandal. So what do you think that the impact of that has been for funders, both positive and negative? There's a lot of conversation around it in the media, in the market too. So yeah, interested just to get your take on how that's been both helpful and potentially unhelpful from a funding perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the positive and negative is an interesting question, largely because, you know, I wasn't involved in the case at all. It was another one of the ALF members in London that was funding that. But if you look at what Mr. Bates says, Mr. Bates was the kind of lead claimant in the litigation. He got the group together. He sort of led the action, and he led the relationship with finding the funding and with the funders, as I understand it. He's came out to say that He couldn't have done it without litigation funding. The litigation funders were a source of huge support. I think as a matter of public record that the ultimate investment that the funder made there was around £24 million, which was 3 times the initial estimate. But the funder stuck with them, and they ultimately, after quite a number of years, and I think the conduct from the post office has been censored in the judgments. The funders ultimately helped the sub postmasters get a result there. So yeah, I would look at what Mr. Bates says with perhaps greater weight than some other commentators in the market might say that maybe have other interests. But just taking on the kind of the big criticism that people have there is the amount that the funders ultimately end up taking from the settlement figure. So again, the headline number that is pointed at doesn't account. It's not just a pure profit figure, if that makes sense. So they invested 24 million. They then got that, and they paid that to lawyers, experts, various insurers. So that was money that was paid out, and then they took a return on that. And it's sometimes forgotten that the amount they got from the settlement proceeds, half of that was just their money back. I know that that's continuing. I think as we're speaking yesterday, Mr. Bates was in a public inquiry talking about the delay that the government has so far had in dealing with compensation with the sub postmasters. But I think if you just look at how unwavering his support has been of the industry in getting to this situation that otherwise they wouldn't have been in, that's really again, maybe I would say this, but I think I'd look at the people closest to it when considering how that impacts what we do.
Thanks, Sean.
I think let's move on to a more kind of forward-looking part of the discussion, and I think we're going to start with obviously the PACCAR decision, which I think was summer 2023 that it was taken by the Supreme Court. So to the audience, in case you've forgotten, the Supreme Court had held that third-party litigation funding agreements, which provide for the funder, should receive a fee calculated by reference to the damages achieved by the funded claimant, or damages-based agreements. So it's kind of been a bit of a tricky one, I think, which the previous government tried to kind of reverse through legislation, but that has stalled. Sean, what do you think the implications of PACCAR have been so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a fair summary. Almost can't believe it's been almost 18 months ago now. I think when it first came out, there was an awful lot of conversations in the market, an awful lot of commentary, people talking about the sky falling in, etc. I think that hasn't really come through. There's still in the UK a very healthy, competitive litigation funding market. People are still making new investments. People are still raising capital. It's not had the kind of the totally seismic effects that I think people were worried about in the short days after. I think the biggest impact probably has been the triggering of the, I think as you mentioned, the legislative review, which some people might say was overdue because we had this kind of uncertainty around the position, and probably the longest term impact of the PACCAR judgment will be ultimately legislation which provides clear and open guidelines for the industry over and above the ALF regulations that we currently have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, obviously, so the Conservative government had brought in on the table the potential legislation, I think, in March last year. But obviously, with the new government in place, everyone was hoping it would make it back onto the table for this year, but it hasn't. I think my understanding, I was reading something from Vincent Mason's, they seem to think that it's not going to be until at least summer 2025 until we see some movement on the legislative side at the earliest. Where do you think that's going to go, and how do you think this government might tackle litigation funding and class actions moving forward?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we were so close to getting it through, and then the general election was called, and it's all kind of been pushed down the track. So I think I mentioned earlier the Civil Justice Council is conducting a review. They published an interim report in October of 2024. They're in a consultation period at the moment. They're looking for responses to that consultation by January 2025. And yeah, as you say, they are then looking to report in the summer of 2025. So I think kind of realistically, if the report is due in summer of 25, then the legislation that will follow on from that report will be, sometime after that. I suppose it will depend on how busy the legislative agenda is. But I certainly think the new government has reaffirmed its commitment to resolving this, and I think that again, going back to the post office case, that has put funding firmly in the agenda of the government. It's not a kind of niche issue. It's one that the government is aware of. So I would expect after that report is finalised and published, that we would see some movement. But as I understand it, the previous bill had sort of cross-party support. It wasn't a very partisan issue. So I think the consultation will be important. I think it's those listening who have a view should get involved in that consultation. I think it's important that we hear from everyone who's involved or interested in the industry to make sure that we're all happy with how it's working.
Absolutely. And, I think given the amount of seats that Labour has, I don't expect there's going to be any issues passing the legislation, whatever it looks like anyway. But on that note, do you have anything else you wanted to add today? Any final remarks?
I would say people often think of funding as a kind of very opaque market. They don't necessarily know quite how it works. There can be some reticence to pick up the phone to us and just sort of ask how it works, ask about any ideas. I would say just we're generally quite a friendly bunch. If you have any questions, or if you have a case or an opportunity that you think might be interesting to talk to us about, don't hesitate to do so. We're happy to educate people as to how it all works, and there's no judgment. So that's probably the thought that I would leave you with.
Dina, do you have anything else you wanted to mention today?
No, just that's been it's been so interesting to hear from you, Sean. I think, it's the way that the funding market operates and the way that it also intersects with how we work as well. Often we're working in teams, more and more so, I'd say, where you've got legal teams, I'm talking their lawyers, counsel, funders, PR comms teams, investigators, all working together to achieve an outcome for the client, whoever that might be, whether it is an individual or right up to a corporate or even a sovereign. And it's just so interesting to hear your kind of thoughts on how the market is and what direction it's traveling. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, it was lovely to have you both on. Thank you so much for taking the time. And to everyone listening, we'll be back for another episode next week. We're on Spotify and not even Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, sorry. So feel free to listen to us anytime. Thank you both.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.